Hello, everyone. Welcome into Above My Pay Grade. My name is Eric. Thanks for tuning in. If you could hit that like button, hit subscribe, really helps out the channel. Now, if you're familiar with the fourth turning or Ray Dalio's YouTube video, The Changing World Order, which I'll link in the description, they both do a good job of talking about the psychology of a economic collapse, which is kind of a symptom. The psychology is a symptom of the economic collapse, but they work in conjunction fairly closely. What I mean by this is in the fourth turning, he often talks about how lessons learned from the past, basically hard times. You guys have probably heard of this cycle. Hard times create hard men create good times create soft men, and soft men create hard times. You've maybe heard of that cycle before. And that's, I don't know if that's a cycle we can ever reverse, to be honest with you, because human beings are fallen. We have a fallen nature. And if you read history, this happens over and over and over again. And Ray Dalio does these five stages, five phases of basically a sovereign country's collapse, economically speaking. And I wanted to go through those with you and talk about what stage I think we're in. And it can kind of give you some insight and prediction into the future as to what you might see and why you might be seeing what you're seeing around you today. So let's take a look at this article here from Bridgewater Capital, Ray Dalio's fund. Okay, so he talks about five stages of sovereign life cycles, sovereign countries, sovereign money, and specifically, he talks about these phases in reference to psychology, but money and psychology, or economics and psychology, are inextricably linked, in my opinion. So, in the first stage, countries are poor and they think they are poor. So, think of a developing country where people, and think about your own psychology. When you're poor, how precious is the money you earn? Because it goes to bills, and every penny when you were struggling goes to uh, productivity or surviving. And if you extrapolate that out across an entire economy, people who say are in that mode are saving, are trying to be as productive as possible and get out of that bottom rung on the ladder. So this is like a newly developing country. America was once here. Think of all the immigrants we had in the early 20th century, all the people who wanted to come here. And so basically, these are people, it says here in the article, in this stage, they have very low incomes, and most people have subsistence lifestyles. They don't waste money because they value it a lot, and they don't have any debt to speak of because savings are short, meaning they have to spend, and nobody wants to lend to them. They're underdeveloped or undeveloped. Okay, America was there, but we're no longer there. So, stage two. In the second stage, countries are getting rich quickly, but still think they are poor. So, think about somebody who was successful in business on a micro scale, and they grew up with these kind of savings roots or values put into them. And even when they're making more money, they still live um, way below their means, intentionally so. So it says here in the article, at this stage, they behave pretty much the same way they did in stage one, but because they have more money and still want to save, the amount of savings and investment rises rapidly, which causes growth in the economy. Because they are typically the same people who experience the more deprived conditions in the first stage, and because these people grew up with financial insecurity, typically they don't lose their financial cautiousness. Think about your grandma, if she grew up during the Great Depression, or your great grandma in my case. Uh, they were very, very cautious with money. They often saved things like ketchup packets from restaurants and sometimes even stole silverware and put it in their purse. My grandma didn't do that, or great grandma didn't do that for sure. But these people knew the value of things, and because at one point in their life, it wasn't there. So they knew the value of savings. So as an economy grows, obviously people start to invest in other people's labor and ideas. And when you're a person who grew up in stage one, which means having nothing, you take those values with you. And as generations pass, and as those lessons weren't learned the hard way, meaning through experience, um, those lessons don't get passed on as well. In the third stage, countries are rich and think of themselves as rich. So capital goods, R&D, are paying off, producing productivity gains. At the same time, the prevailing psychology changes in the country from putting the emphasis on working and saving to protect oneself from bad times to easing up in order to savor the fruits of life. This change in the prevailing psychology occurs primarily because the new generation of people who did not experience the bad times replaces those who lived through them. For me, this is, and I'm not disparaging them, but this is the baby boomer generation. This generation, they lived kind of between wars. Most of them weren't drafted in the Vietnam War. They were born after, or they were too young to be drafted. And an economic boom time beyond all comparison happened in the from the 80s when it comes to dropping rates to now. So, in the lessons of like the Great Depression and World War II, although fresh in maybe their grandparents' minds, it wasn't fresh in theirs because they didn't experience it. And this is the stage I think we're in, stage 4. In the fourth stage, countries become poorer and still think of themselves as rich. So, in review, poor and they know they're poor. They're rich, but they think they're poor. In the third stage, they're rich and they think of themselves as rich. And now we're in stage 4, which is they're becoming poorer, but they still have that mindset of like, hey, I can spend this much money as a country because we've always been bringing in the goods, but they're no longer doing that. Okay, so in stage 4, capital goods and R&D are paying off. Or sorry, we're at stage 3. In the leveraging up phase, debts rise relative to incomes until they can't anymore. Think on a macro and a micro level. Macro level, our country has massive amounts of debt. People want to live off the future by pulling demand into the present. And then think of credit cards. Credit card debt is all-time high. Savings is all-time low. And this is all after those had reversed during COVID. The psychological shift behind the leveraging up occurs because the people who lived through the first 2 stages have died off or become irrelevant, and those whose behaviors matter most are using it to live well and not worrying about the pain of not having enough money. So all the lessons of the past, bad time, wisdom of the past is something we don't necessarily pay attention today, and most of the people who lived through the Great Depression, actually all of them, have probably passed on. Same thing with people in World War II. And you're seeing people approach debt in a much different way today. More and more and more debt is kind of the the cry of our generation when it comes to college, more housing, credit card debt, car debt, all that debt. But then extrapolate that out to our national debt has tripled in the last 10 years, give or take. Okay, further reading here. Since they are reluctant to constrain their spending in line with their reduced income growth rate, both of this country and individually, they lower their savings rate, increase their debts, and cut corners. Because their spending continues to be strong, does that ring a bell? We talk about a strong economy. We talk about the labor market. And where's that spending coming from? Is it coming from productivity or is it coming from debt? It's coming from debt. They continue to appear rich, even though their balance sheets are deteriorating. They typically spend a lot of money in these countries on the military at this stage, sometimes very large amounts because of wars, in order to protect their global interest. Often, though not always, the advanced stages of this phase, countries run twin deficits, i.e., both balance of payments and government deficits. Does that ring a bell? Does that sound like all Western economies today? Specifically the United States? Yes. All right, so what comes after? That's the phase I think we're in. And Ray Dalio is an excellent thinker on this topic. So what would come next? In the last stage of the cycle, they are typically going through a deleveraging, meaning they have to get out of this debt. How do they do it? They either go bankrupt or they print. Only two options, or they spend less. But that option is always off the table when it comes to government. Um, and I'm still reading that book, The Death of Money. And even in Germany, like as people lose their jobs, people turn to the government more. Understandably so. That's just the way it's going to be. And so government is going to acquiesce to those demands and continue to print. So there's only two ways to deleverage. That is declare bankruptcy, aka we're not paying off these treasuries. And individually, that would be I'm not paying on the credit cards, which means you can't borrow in the future, both for a country and an individual, or they print. And that governments have always printed. After the bubbles burst and when deleveraging occur, private debt growth, private sector spending, asset values, and net worths decline in a self-reinforcing negative cycle. If you don't have money to spend, like the recession we're going into, potential depression, what does that do to the economy, which has ripple effects on businesses? And people can't buy houses, so it has ripple effects on both the stock market and housing values. As an extension of these economic and financial trends, countries in this stage see their power in the world decline. Now, a lot of people think that China's on the rise. And by the way, they have a lot of the same problems we do when it comes to economics. And my thinking, reading the history and trying to understand macro as best I can, we are in a unique time in history where all this globalism and Western economies are in very similar boats, meaning their debt to GDP is astronomical. So, who's going to stand out from the pack? I think emerging countries who are in phase one or phase two, because in a way, once you get to phase five, you got to go back to phase one. That's what you do. Um, and a new generation comes and they realize it's elbow grease and effort that gets them to where they want to go, and it's savings and investing and not speculating, but saving and investing that on a micro scale makes them successful, and on a macro scale makes the country successful economically. But let me know what phase you think we're in. I think we're on our way to phase five. But I thought that was interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments below. See you all in the next one. Peace.